Hello everybody, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of the Interceptor. As I mentioned in the last video, pretty busy up here, but I have slowly been working on the Interceptor, bit by bit. Show you where I'm currently at. I've gone ahead and sprayed black primer on the wing panels. I'm just going to leave it that color because, why not? For my black primer choice, I like to use Mr. Finishing Surface, Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black from Mr. Hobby. It's my favorite black primer, regardless of whether it's airbrush or not. And I usually thin that about 50-50 with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. And I really like that combination. It sprays very smooth, it evens out, and that helps to preserve this hatched detail on the wings. The actual detail itself is not overly even, but it's good enough that it, I don't know how much of a moire it's producing on the camera. I can't really tell with my preview window, but I'm going to leave that as is, let that dry a little bit so I can mask over it so that I can do the rest of my painting and whatnot. Same black primer for the floor pan. You see a little bit of silver dry brushing I did there. Pilot and the window frame. This is actually going to be a very dark gray color when it's all said and done, but for the rest of the interior colors and whatnot, I went with this, which is actually Tamiya surface primer, just regular gray surface primer that I decant for airbrush use. And I like to do it that way because, number one, it sprays really well, and number two, it minimizes overspray, aka wasted paint, which for me means wasted money. So after doing that, letting the primer dry for a little while, I then went and sprayed all the interior colors with pale blue-gray from Vallejo Model Air. This is 71.046, which is actually a very close match to the Tamiya Primer Gray. And then for the seat, just to be a little different, I went with, if I can find, actually I actually don't have it on me right now, but this is Aggressor Gray, which comes off as a little bit darker. And once all that had a chance to dry, then went in and did a little bit of detail painting. Give you an example here of the pilot. If it will zoom, if it will focus properly, there you go. There's the pilot. Took a little bit of liberty with the eyes just to make them a bit more visible, but get the camera back in focus. There you go. But just little spots of color here and there. Some Vallejo silver on some of the shiny bits. A little bit of Liquitex basics. Red, white, and blue for the buttons and switches and stuff. And the knobs on the chairs and little consoles and things like that. Just blocking in a little bit of color, some contrast. In a few spots, I did use a gray wash. Help try to bring out some of the detail. For that, not that, dummy. I use this. Model wash from Vallejo, light gray. This is a 67.515. And I plan on actually using this as a wash on the exterior of the Interceptor as well. I bought this specifically for that. So really all I have left to do now is let all this dry. Do that overnight, and then I can come back and glue the cockpit together, see about getting it into the bulb, and I'll come back and show you what that looks like. So stay with me. And the cockpit is now been fully assembled and put into the lower half of the bulb here. See if I can zoom in here and or focus, and it's a pretty decent shot. All little details and whatnot going on there. Just all hand painted, of course, like I said before. Just use super glue to put everything in. A combination of medium and thick and accelerator. And yeah, it's pretty much that. I did use a little bit of cement where the base or the bottom of the floor pan meets this mounting tube. It does actually make contact there. So I did it that way because I want to make sure this is fully secure. There's just enough wiggle room that if this were to pop loose, the cockpit would rattle a little bit. But the next step is to go ahead and get the top half of the bulb cemented on or cemented in place. And then I can start worrying about gaps and seams and adding a few extra greebles and whatnot here and there. I am going to go ahead, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but leave the window frame and the top hatch off, at least for the moment, because I'm not going to be using the clear glass. I'm going to stick with the more traditional ILM aesthetic, but that would make masking around these a little bit more difficult than just bulk masking through the openings as they are here. So these will get put on near the end, but for now I am going to treat these as separate things. But this will have to get glued on. This is the back detail. There will be a little bit of some putty work there that'll have to be done. There'll have to be some putty work here along the seam as well. Places where plastic just doesn't meet plastic, just dead space. But other than that, really, I just want to let this dry a little bit longer, and then I can think about actually getting the two halves of the bulb together. So I'll do that, and I'll be back. And the two halves of the bulb have now been fully cemented together. I've also glued on the little ion pod greeblies here on either side. I need to drill out the holes for that, or for them, give them a little bit more sense of depth. I wanted to do that after they were cemented on. I also glued on this back detail bit here. A little bit of some gap to deal with. I'll talk about that in a second, but my cement of choice normally is to be extra thin. So what I did is I cemented the two halves together, clamped them, and then while they were clamped, I also brushed on a little bit of MEK, straight MEK. I got this at, I think it was Lowe's a couple of years ago. I got a gallon of it because it actually was on sale. I don't know why, but it was. So I bought a gallon of it and been putting them in these little glass jars. And this will pretty much last me for the rest of my life. And MEK is a pretty good plastic solvent for various things. But yeah, I just brushed a little bit of that in, let it drizzle, let the capillary action draw that into all the little gaps and seams to deal with. Nothing too fantastical there. And then I let that dry up and the plastic harden up overnight. Like I said, I had some seams and gaps to deal with. One thing that I do want to mention is that the upper half of the bulb on both of my TIE Fighter kits, or both my TIE Fighter models from the dual kit, were bowed upward as you went out toward the ends of the wing supports here. And because it was both models in the same box, I don't know if that's a well-known thing with the dual TIE Fighter kit or if it's just something specific to mine. But I just want to mention that in case you have ever thought about maybe wanting to put one of these together yourself. But once everything was cemented and clamped, it straightened out just fine. But That's now done. I've also dealt with the gaps and seam work on here. A little bit of some sanding and filing, and then areas where I had a little bit of some gap, just where plastic did not meet plastic. I use putty, but my putty of choice for stuff like this is actually Liquitex modeling paste. Like Vallejo putty or perfect plastic putty, this is basically a very thick acrylic gel medium, similar to toothpaste. It's got marble dust in it so that it hardens and can be sanded. This is actually starting to thicken a little bit. The more you leave the lid off of it, the more it thickens. It actually says that on the label. You want to thicken it up, like slop onto an artist canvas or something. You leave the lid open, but I usually, if it does start to thicken, I just put a little bit of water in here and mix it back to the right consistency. And this has lasted me for quite a while. So you just, goosh a little bit of that in there. Take a wet Q-tip. I have some wet, not wet, but I have some pointed Q-tips that I use. I get these super cheap off Amazon. You can buy them in packs. I think it's like 800 or something. They last me quite a while. Just take a damp Q-tip and mop away the excess. Kind of like I treat acrylic putty, kind of like grout. Slop it in, trowel out the excess, and let that dry. So yeah, that's now together. Seams and gaps are dealt with, or at least as much as I want to. For the gap back here, what I did is I actually thinned down that modeling paste with water. The good thing about it being acrylic is that you can thin with water. And then just using a tiny little brush, I just drizzle some of that in there. I kind of build that up layer by layer and just slowly drizzle that in. And then any excess that I need to clean up, I can just scrape and sand away later. But it is an acrylic at heart, so you need to give it plenty of time to dry. But I think the next step now is to go ahead and prime this using some more of my Tamiya surface primer, and then come back in and do a little bit of pre-shading with some more of my Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. Now, I normally don't do pre-shading a lot on my models. I've just never had much of a reason to. But I would like to get into doing that, especially for Star Wars kits. I think the kits do wind up looking a little better if they're pre-shaded. My only concern is that when it comes to base coating, I'm a completionist. I am a completionist. I don't stop painting base coat colors until everything is covered, and that kind of defeats the purpose of pre-shading. So I'll need to be a little bit careful with that step to make sure I don't cover up what I do here. It's the other reason why I'm doing black. It'll be a little harder to cover that as well. But I think that's the next step. Prime this, a little pre-shading on it. Those are lacquers, so they should dry relatively quick. And then once that's done, I will probably then see about getting the wings cemented on. So I'll get back to work on this and show you what that looks like. And I've now managed to get everything masked, primed, and pre-shaded a little bit. Pretty happy with how this has come out. Of course, it's now in the ugly stage. It's got to look ugly before it starts to look pretty again. But what I did is I masked off the wing panels with some Tamiya tape. It took a little while. Might have to be some wee little itty-bitty bits of touch-up when it's all said and done. But got that masked off. I sprayed more of the Tamiya surface primer through the airbrush, covered everything as best I could. You can see a little bit of it coming through on the bulb here. And once I gave that a chance to dry, I took more of the 1500 black and thinned that with more of the leveling thinner. I think I went with more like a 60-40 mix of thinner and paint. And then broke out my Pache Talon, my standard, or my go-to airbrush yet again. This time I went with the smallest needle I had, 0.25 millimeter. Dialed the pressure down a little bit, about 20 psi, so I could do some be a little bit more, have a little bit more fine line control with it. And then just did my best to follow the panel lines, outline, and cover the greebly details. Maybe a little bit on the heavy-handed side, but like I said, I don't do this all that often. I've never had much of a need to, but just trying to get that sort of mottled or modulated, mottled look, a little bit of variation. I know enough about it that imperfection kind of is, or at least a little bit of imperfection is kind of useful. There's the top hatch. Window frame really hasn't changed because that's got to get a dark gray over it, and that's a pretty regular looking thing. But yeah, that's it. I've got all the priming done I think I want to get done. I think the next step is to go ahead and cement the wings onto the bulb. That way, well, I did mask off here to try to keep the spare plastic, because once that's cemented, there'll probably need to be a little bit of some putty work, maybe. I don't know. Depends on how well the cementing goes and just how tight of a join that is. But in either case, I will have to touch up around it with more of the black when it's fully cemented. And then after that, give that a chance to all dry and harden up nice and well. Then I think I will actually be ready for base coat. So I think that'll probably be the subject of the next video. I think once I get everything cemented and all the pre-shading and priming touched up, I think then I'll hold off on actual painting for part 3. So, but let me go ahead and let this dry a little bit. Let this dry overnight. Sometime tomorrow I'll cement this together, and maybe by the end of tomorrow I'll be able to touch up the primer and show you what that looks like. So let me do that, and I will be back. And the Interceptor wings are now cemented in place. I think this is the last little update clip for part 2. Video, I'm pretty sure, is going to start getting kind of long. My apologies if my voice sounds a little scratchy. The dehumidifier is running in the background. I've got noise cancellation on because it's a little damp and warm out there today. First real summer day we've had so far this year. But as I said, the wings are now fully cemented in place. So there's our pre-shaded, dirty-looking Interceptor. Again, in the ugly stage at the moment. For cementing the wings in place, I used Plastruct Bonding, which is methyl chloride or methylene chloride, or more formally known as bonding. In my experience, it's one of the fastest drying plastic solvents I've worked with, and that's the reason why I used it, because I didn't want to sit around and baby these wings for a long time. So I wanted something fast acting. So I just snapped the wings in place. Any place I saw plastic on plastic contact, got a couple drizzles of this. That's where the capillary action draws it in because it's very, very thin. And then it says it has a cure time of about 30 minutes. I gave each wing 45 minutes. Treated each one separately. After that, for the wing caps here, I used Tamiya Extra Thin because that gives you time to brush that on the parts and then press them into place. Get a little bit longer working time with Tamiya than you do the bonding or the straight MEK. And then finally, one thing I want to point out, if you're going to try doing this kit bash yourself, it's not really going to be able to show you this too much on camera, but there we go. Right here and right here, where the back of these struts meet against the flat panel of the wing, on the back side, both top and bottom, there were a couple little holes, and that's because the actual hole on the wing that this cap piece covers, the back corners were actually little square corners, and the footprint of this strut just doesn't quite cover, or did not quite cover that. So I took, I reached into what little evergreen plastic I have. I don't have a lot, but I did have fairly small square plastic rod. I think just maybe a touch too big for this scale. But I cut that into little lengths and cemented right on top of that, or right on top of those holes. And then went in with more of my Mr. Surfacer 1500, an old throwaway synthetic brush, and just kind of a combination of brushed and dry brushed, sort of a mix of the two over those areas. Didn't have to be too precise. A lot of that's going to get covered with the whole color anyway. Again, it's really just a little bit of extra pre-shading there and helping to cover up that white styrene and what little last vestiges of a seam or a join might be there. You can see it. You can even actually see where the parts meet. A little darker there than other places, as it should be, because these are the most recessed parts of the ship when you think about it. But anyway, the Interceptor, I think, is now at the point where it is ready for its color coats. I'm going to be using Tamiya for that, which is a fairly fast drying paint, because I need something fast drying. I am working up against a deadline here. I have to have this done and pictures submitted to HobbyLink International by May 2nd. I think I'll make it, but the faster I can work, or the faster things can dry, the better. But I want to let this dry for the rest of the day, and then tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, if the weather's crappy, I can think about painting inside for that. But before I call an end to this video, because part 3 will be all about getting the actual hull colors and accent colors down, I want to talk a little bit about the base, because I really haven't said much about it. This is my Slave 1. This is the 144th Bandai kit I built for the 2021 Star Wars group build to last year, about the same time, around the end of April. And I am really, really proud of this ship. It's one of my best to date. I even put some basic lighting in it for the engines. Probably see some of the flickering for that. But because I put lighting in it, you know, all the electronics and circuitry there's my spaghetti mess. I needed a different base for it, rather than the Bespin base. So I looked around Amazon for a little bit, and I found these boxes. And that is merely a painted version of this. These are clear acrylic stackable organizer boxes, I guess, for home office or office use. But they're fairly thick acrylic, pretty heavy duty. They're still easy enough to drill and file through if you're careful about it. Turn them upside down, they're hollow, and they have on the stackable bit what looks like a little bit of accent trim or flare. So it doesn't look just like a monotonous box. In this case, a somewhat dusty box. This needs cleaned up a little bit, or dusted. These are nice little boxes. I'm definitely going to be using more of these for my 1000 scale starships, and probably other Bandai kits and things like the Interceptor, where I'm not going to be putting any lighting in or being very simple about the lighting and the wiring and the circuit boards I'll be using. The actual box that I'm using for this build is this one. Yesterday morning, I went out to the garage. I found, or I got out my old scrap piece of 2x4, cut out 1.5 inch, roughly 1.5 inch square from it, epoxied that inside using a 30-minute epoxy, tacked that in place with a little bit of CA glue, clamped it down, let that dry for about 24 hours. Then this morning, I went and drilled a 7/32 inch hole right down the middle using my drill press. I just basically started with a small drill bit, made sure it was as centered as I could get it, and then just kept stepping up the bit size till I got to something that fit the brass tube nice and tight. The base, I think, is ready for paint. I've scruffed it up with some 600 grit Sandpaper, I just need to wipe it down with a little alcohol, go over it with tack cloth, and then I'll just use plain old Rust-Oleum primer and paint on it. Today's actually the perfect weather to be doing it. So I think as soon as I turn off the camera, I'll actually be doing that. But I'll hold off on uploading that clip until part 3, because that also involves the actual final colors, just like the Interceptor. So part 3 will be all about getting the main colors onto both the ship and the base. I'm not going to be painting the brass tube. I'll just clean it up real well. Since I'll be able to remove it at whim, I can always detach it and clean it back up and repolish it if need be, if it ever does start to tarnish. So, yeah, that will be the subject of part 3. Part 4, we'll probably stick to the weathering, do the wash, and final flat clears, and then there'll also probably be a little showcase video on May the 4th. Get everything set up to take some nice pictures, good lighting. If you like the video, please consider giving it a big thumbs up. Comment down below. I keep being told any form of interaction does help with the channel, so that's why I keep saying it. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, both current and new. You guys and gals are all awesome. I don't have a lot of statistics to work with. I don't have a lot of subscribers. I don't have a very high number of view counts, but I have just enough for some stats. And I know that most people who watch these videos are not subscribed. So if you aren't, consider subscribing, clicking the bell icon, or don't. It's your decision. There's no obligation. And you can always change your mind later. So I'll leave it at that. So until part 3, take care, stay safe, and happy modeling. Bye-bye, everybody.